So we've made our bound buttonholes. Now let's install our buttons. You're going to need the bound buttonhole right garment pattern cut from muslin and the bound buttonhole right facing pattern. That should already be interfaced. Make sure your notches are cut, and for our pieces we should have the seam allowance transferred over. I'm not going to be able to mark my seam allowance on the wrong side of my interfacing here, but if you have white interfacing, you should be able to mark that with some chalk. I'm going to clip my notches here. So once notches are clipped and we know where our seam allowance is, we can start assembly for this. Hold on to this pattern, your right garment pattern. We're going to use this as a template later. And I can put right sides together, matching up my notches on either end. Pin and stitch these together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning and at the end. So that seam is sewn. I'll take this to the iron, press this open, and then put the facing behind the garment and press it flat. Once that's nice and pressed open, can put the two pieces wrong sides together so the interfacing should get covered, and then press that seam right along that fold. Let that cool. And then back to the machine for top stitching. Just as we did on the buttonhole side, I'm going to top stitch this. I want to make sure I'm top stitching through the correct side. This piece that has the interfacing is my facing. This would go to the inside of my garment. So I want to make sure I'm top stitching from this side that just has the muslin, because this would be the side that is visible for all to see. Still sewing in a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. A little bit of top stitching on there to hold everything together. So now we've got our 2 sides. Imagine this is the front of a coat or a jacket of some kind, and our buttonholes would lie on top of our buttons, and then we can push our buttons through the buttonholes. So we've applied our facings. Remember, the facing gets an interfacing for gets fusible interfacing for stability. Same thing over here. Here's my facing that has interfacing. And as I mentioned at the sewing machine, our facings tend to sit closer to the body. So I'm looking at the outside of my garment at this point, and this would be the inside that would lay close to the wearer's body. Make sure your top stitched edges are facing one another, because if we try to install our buttons over here, it doesn't make a difference. That's not going to help. We just went through all that trouble of pressing and top stitching so that we could apply a facing to clean finish this raw edge at the center of our garment. So make sure your top stitch edges are in this orientation. Make sure we're not doing anything like this or like this or like this. Make sure you've got those two edges pointing at each other. So now I can grab my template. Now I've removed my 1/2 inch seam allowance because that's already gotten sewn into place. So I'm going to match up the notches on my pattern with this folded edge, this clean finished edge. And we can either use tailor's tacks or friction pen to copy these little points from our template. Just going to poke through the paper with my friction pen. See if I can get some points on my fabric. Okay. And I can remove that. There are my little points. So I know where to install my buttons, and if we line these up, you can see they fit pretty close to the center lines of our buttonholes. I have a button with 2 holes in it that I'll be using for the demos. Your buttons might have 4 holes. That looks something like this. They might have 4 holes in them. That's perfectly fine. 2 holes or 4 holes doesn't make a difference. When you're doing 2 holes, you'll either align the holes vertically or horizontally. Either horizontally like this or vertically like this. And then you just stitch back and forth between the 2 holes to lock that in place. If you've got 4 holes, you can place your button with this kind of orientation where all the holes are vertical and horizontal, or you can orient it diagonally where it looks more like a diamond shape. And when you sew a button that has 4 holes, you can either sew back and forth between 2 of those holes and back and forth between the other 2, so you have 2 parallel lines of stitching, or you can sew diagonally between these 2 holes and then between these 2 holes to create a crisscross shape. Totally up to you. What you do not want to use for this sample are buttons that look like this. This is a very tiny button for this example, but this is a shank button. It has a partially spherical top to it, and at the bottom is a little piece of plastic with a hole going through it. This is a shank button. Do not use these for our sample because it will not work for what we're doing, and unless you know exactly how to install these, I will not be covering their installation in this video. So avoid shank buttons. Buttonholes for shank buttons are a little bit different. It's a different size than what we tend to use for these flat buttons. So make sure you're using a flat button either with 2 holes or 4 holes. I'm going to grab some thread, and I'll use some black thread just so it's visible on camera. And I'm going to use a double length of thread. So I'm going to put the 2 ends of my thread together and knot these together. And let's take a look at our sample here. I'm going to start with this button hole right here. Now, for this sample, you are free to stitch through all the layers. When you're working on a garment, however, you may want to practice just stitching through the top layer of fabric and maybe catching a little bit of the interfacing so that everything holds together. But for our sample, I would recommend stitching through all of the layers. I'm just going to go in and out through this tailor's tack through all the layers. There's my needle coming through the back. Again, I'm keeping my hand underneath so I can feel when that needle comes through. Tiny little stitch, and that will anchor our knot right here in our fabric. And if you're using an opaque button, like a black button, something you can't see through, you'd never know that knot of thread was sitting under there. I'm just going to clean up the little tails on my knot because it is looking a little unsightly. There we go. But I'm using a clear button so you can clearly see what my stitchers are doing underneath here. So I've just taken one little stitch, anchored my thread, and I'm going to go up through one of the holes in my button. And I'm just going to lay that down flat, just so I can position that. I'm going to sew my buttons horizontally like this. So I'm going to orient my two holes horizontally. So I've come up through one hole. I'm going to go down through the opposite. And this is where, with a 4-button hole, you can decide whether you're going to go up through this one and then down through this one to make a diagonal shape, or like this diagonally, or if you're going to go up and down through similar sides or horizontally. You have a couple of options with a 4-button hole. So now my button is just kind of hanging out here. I've got this stitch. It's gone in and out through each of these holes here. I'm going to go back into my fabric, pick up another tiny stitch right by that tailor's tack, in and out through both layers. Pull my needle. Now, what's important when you're sewing in these buttons, you do not want to put the death grip on your thread. Do not pull it super, super tight. If you pull your thread too tight, it's going to cause your fabric to buckle, and it's going to make attaching the button to your buttonholes very difficult. Now, there are several techniques for allowing a space. You want a tiny bit of space left between your button and your garment. It doesn't have to be excessive. It doesn't have to be 1/4 of an inch. You don't need a big old gap of space in between there. Just don't pull this too tight. But as a fail-safe, to help prevent you from stitching too tight, you can use a sewing pin, you can use a toothpick. People have a variety of methods for keeping their threads loose. I'm going to use a sewing pin. I'm going to slide that sewing pin right underneath this stitching, this one stitch that I've made in my button. So it's just sitting underneath those threads. And I'm just going to let that sit there and create a little bit of an anchor for me so that I won't stitch too tight. So I've taken a stitch in my fabric, I've come up through one hole, down through the other, and taken another stitch in my fabric. And I'm going to repeat that about 2 or 3 times. And if you're working with a 2-button hole, that's really all we need to do is loop it over about 2 or 3 times. If you're doing a 4-button hole, you'll have to loop it over 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 times. So it takes longer to install these. And you've got to be really particular about where you're setting your button. You'll also notice with this particular kind of button, it's a little concave. It's got a little bit of a divot inside of here. It's not totally flat. So if I were to place my sewing pin across here, there's a big gap before it would reach the bottom of the button, and it might make it too loose if I were to do this same technique here. So what I might do for a button like this, rather than putting the pin through the threads here, I might place my pin underneath my button and maybe anchor it a little bit in the fabric. Again, just to create a little bit of a spacer between the button and the garment, just so I don't stitch too tight. Okay, so I've taken a stitch, I've gone up and down from my left to the right. I'm going to do the same thing, go up through the left hole. I'm just sliding my needle underneath there. I'm not taking any stitches in my fabric, just sliding the needle up through my left hole and then back down through the right. And you're going to have to fold your fabric out of the way so that you can get your needle in there. And then I'll take another little stitch in my garment. There we go, taking another stitch, pulling that through. And before I pull that too tight, I'm going to put my pin back just to make sure I'm not locking it down too tight. And I'll do that one more time, up through this leftmost hole, down through the rightmost hole, and take another stitch in my fabric. The positioning of your stitching in the fabric does not have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be in the same place every time. Just somewhere underneath that button, close to where those holes are, close to where your thread is going. And that's really, that's the majority of it right there. Just gone through those holes 3 times. That's plenty, especially if I'm using a double length of thread. And what I'll do, before I finish everything off, I'm going to remove my pin. I don't need that spacer anymore. I'm going to hold on to my thread, and I'm going to create what's called, I'm going to create a thread shank. We talked about a shank button, a button that has a little shank at the bottom for threading. These kinds of buttons do not have shanks on the bottom, but we're going to use the thread to create a shank. That shank helps to lift the button away from the garment ever so slightly to make room for all this extra fabric and whatnot that we have from our buttonholes and the opposite side of a garment. So I'm going to take my thread in my hand, and this is why I'm using a clear button, and I'm going to wrap my thread around and around and around about 3 or 4 times, and it's going to create a little bit of a lift for me. So it just wraps it around, creating a teeny little bit of lift there. About 4 times is fine. And that creates a tiny little thread shank. It also acts as security, gives those threads a little bit more strength for wear and tear. And you can kind of let the thread loose. It's not going to unwind itself. It'll be fine. But I'm going to hold on to it, and I'm going to fold my garment fabric back so I have access to just the garment fabric. And I'm going to take a tiny little stitch through my garment fabric. Tiny little stitch. Not catching the button, just going through the garment. I'm going to pull that. And that tiny stitch will help anchor that thread I just wrapped around. I'm going to do one more tiny stitch. And you've probably guessed what's going to happen next. As soon as this loop starts to form, I'm going to place my needle through that loop. Pull it tight, create a little knot to anchor my thread, and you can snip your thread. And again, if you're using opaque buttons, no one would ever know that there was thread underneath there. It would be covered up by your button, but because I'm using clear button, there's a big old mess of thread under there. And again, on final garments, you can practice just stitching through this top layer. You'll get accustomed to keeping your hand underneath and feeling in case your needle comes through. And if you feel the needle come through the back, you know you've stitched too far and you kind of throttle back a little bit. I'm going to install my second button really quickly here. Just so you can see that again. Sorry, went in and out through that hole. One more stitch to anchor that in place. And try to keep my thread from twisting. Okay. 2 buttons installed. Clean up my workspace here. Two buttons installed, 2 bound buttonholes installed. And now all we need to do is put the buttonhole side over the button side and push our buttons through. Pull this taut, and you can see why we left that little extra 1/8 of an inch on our buttonholes to make room for this big old wad of thread shank that we created. This way our buttons still seat themselves where they should in the center of our garment. When we practice, when we go to do our jacket, we'll be doing bound buttonholes on our jacket, and you'll see that these buttons will sit right in the center of the body. So that is our bound buttonhole sample completed.